The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional rustling of papers. The air felt heavy with tension. A major case was unfolding, and everyone in the room knew it. The defendant, a wealthy businessman, sat at the defense table, his expensive suit perfectly pressed. His lawyer, known for his aggressive tactics, stood beside him. Across the room sat the prosecution. They had a key witness, a black man named Marcus Reed. He was an ordinary working-class citizen who had witnessed something important. His testimony could change everything. Marcus sat nervously in the witness stand, hands folded in his lap. He wasn't used to being in a courtroom. His heart pounded, but he knew he had to tell the truth. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, looked over her glasses. "Counsel, you may begin," she said, giving the defense lawyer the floor. The lawyer smirked as he stood. His name was Richard Holloway, and he had built his career on winning cases by any means necessary. His voice was smooth but cold as he approached the witness stand. "Mr. Reed," he said, drawing out the name as if it were a joke, "let's talk about what you claim to have seen." Marcus straightened his back. "I saw everything clearly," he said firmly. Holloway chuckled. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning to the jury with a knowing glance. Then, he flipped open his notes and adjusted his tie, ready to tear Marcus apart. The courtroom felt smaller. The tension grew heavier. This wasn't going to be a fair testimony. Everyone could feel it. But no one expected just how far Holloway would go. Holloway took a slow step toward the witness stand, his expression smug. He glanced at the jury, flashing a confident smirk, then turned his gaze back to Marcus. "So, Mr. Reed," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "you expect this court to believe that you, just an everyday man, happened to witness something so important?" Marcus kept his face steady. "I saw exactly what happened," he replied. Holloway let out a small chuckle. "Of course you think you did." He flipped through his notes lazily. "Tell me, Mr. Reed, where exactly do you work?" Marcus hesitated for a second. "I work at a warehouse downtown." "A warehouse," Holloway repeated, nodding dramatically. "And what exactly do you do there? Move boxes? Load trucks?" "I oversee shipments," Marcus answered. Holloway sighed, shaking his head. "Right. So you're not a trained investigator. You're not a professional observer. You don't have any special skills that would make your testimony reliable, do you?" Marcus clenched his jaw. "I know what I saw." "But do you? Really?" Holloway pressed, his voice mocking. "Or is it possible that your perspective, your limited experience, made you misunderstand the situation?" Someone in the audience shifted uncomfortably. The prosecution attorney frowned but stayed silent, waiting for the right moment to object. Holloway didn't stop. He waved a hand dismissively. "I mean, let's be honest. A man in your position, in your neighborhood, must see all kinds of things. Crime, trouble, people making false claims. Isn't that right?" Marcus stiffened. He knew what Holloway was implying. The words were carefully chosen, not direct enough to be called out, but sharp enough to sting. "I see the truth," Marcus said firmly, "and that's why I'm here." Holloway chuckled again. "Oh, we'll see about that, Mr. Reed." He turned to the jury, flashing them a knowing look. "Because I'm about to prove that your truth is nothing but a misunderstanding." The room grew colder. Marcus knew this wasn't just questioning. This was an attack, and it wasn't over yet. Marcus took a deep breath. He had expected tough questions, but not this level of disrespect. He sat up straighter, determined to stay calm. "I know exactly what I saw," he said. Holloway smirked. "Oh, do you? All right, Mr. Reed, let's go over it again. Slowly, this time." He walked toward the jury, flipping through his notes. "You claim you saw my client, Mr. Lancaster, at the scene of the incident." "Yes," Marcus answered. "And you're absolutely certain?" "Yes." Holloway sighed loudly. "That's strange because, as we all know, it was dark outside. The street wasn't well lit, isn't that right?" Marcus frowned. "It wasn't pitch black. There were lights from the stores nearby." Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Ah, but you think those lights were enough? What if your eyes were playing tricks on you? Maybe you thought you saw Mr. Lancaster, but really, it was just a shadow. A trick of the light. That happens, doesn't it?" Marcus shook his head. "No, I saw his face clearly," Holloway chuckled. "Clearly? Even from across the street? Even with people moving around?" "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "I saw him." The lawyer sighed dramatically, turning back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a warehouse worker with no experience in observation, no special training, yet he's asking us to take his word as absolute truth. He turned back to Marcus. Tell me, Mr. Reed, do you wear glasses? Marcus narrowed his eyes. No. Contacts? No. Holloway smirked again. So, you have perfect vision? Yes, Marcus said through clenched teeth. Holloway spread his hands. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? A few chuckles spread through the courtroom. Marcus felt his frustration grow, but he kept his voice steady. I know what I saw, and I'm not backing down. The smirk on Holloway's face faded for just a second, but then he laughed lightly and flipped another page in his notes. All right, Mr. Reed, he said smoothly. Let's see how well you really remember that night. Marcus braced himself. This was only getting worse. Holloway tapped his fingers against the podium, pretending to think. Then, he looked up at Marcus with a smirk. Mr. Reed, let's talk about your background, he said. Marcus frowned. My background? Yes. Where you come from, your neighborhood. The kind of people you associate with. The prosecution lawyer shifted in their seat. The judge glanced up, but didn't say anything yet. Marcus straightened his back. I live in the city. I work hard. I mind my business. Holloway chuckled. I'm sure you do. But let's be honest, Mr. Reed. A man like you, growing up in certain areas, must be used to seeing crime. Seeing things go down, maybe even looking the other way when it happens. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. I don't look the other way. That's why I'm here. Holloway nodded slowly, pretending to consider. Sure, but maybe, just maybe, you're used to assuming the worst. Maybe you expected to see my client doing something illegal, so your mind filled in the blanks. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Someone in the jury frowned. The prosecution attorney stood. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? The judge gave Holloway a sharp look. Watch your line of questioning, Mr. Holloway. Holloway raised his hands innocently. Of course, Your Honor. I'm simply establishing the witness's perspective. He turned back to Marcus, his smile returning. Tell me, Mr. Reed, have you ever been in trouble with the law? Marcus clenched his jaw. No. Never, Holloway pressed. Not even a small incident? A misunderstanding? Never, Marcus said firmly. Holloway sighed dramatically. Well, that's surprising, he turned to the jury. Because statistics tell us that. Objection, the prosecution snapped. Sustained, the judge said, her voice firm. Move on, Mr. Holloway. For a moment, a flash of annoyance crossed Holloway's face. Then he smiled again. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to Marcus, lowering his voice slightly. You see, Mr. Reed, I'm just trying to understand why you seem so sure about something that could ruin a man's life. Maybe it's because you wanted to see what you saw. Maybe that's just how your mind works. The room was silent. Marcus clenched his fists under the stand. He wasn't going to let this man break him. The judge's gavel struck the desk. That's enough, Mr. Holloway, she said sharply. Keep your questions relevant. Holloway raised his hands, faking innocence. Of course, Your Honor. I'm simply doing my job. Marcus took a steady breath. The lawyer wasn't just questioning him, he was trying to humiliate him. Holloway turned back to Marcus, his smirk returning. Let's focus on the night of the incident again. You say you saw my client at the scene. But let's be honest, Mr. Reed, how good is your memory, really? Marcus didn't flinch. I remember clearly. Do you? Holloway tapped his chin. Tell me, what color was the car parked across the street? Marcus hesitated. He hadn't focused on the car. He had focused on the man. Holloway's smirk widened. Oh, you don't remember? But I thought you had a clear memory? I remember what matters. Marcus shot back. Holloway chuckled. Interesting, and what were you wearing that night? Marcus frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Oh, just checking how sharp your memory really is? Holloway said smoothly. After all, if you can't remember simple details, how can we trust your testimony? Marcus clenched his jaw. I remember who I saw. Holloway waved a dismissive hand. Maybe you think you do. The prosecution attorney finally stood. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. The judge's face hardened. Sustained. Mr. Holloway, if you continue this behavior, I will hold you in contempt. Holloway chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Understood, Your Honor? But his arrogance didn't fade. He turned back to Marcus with a look of amusement, as if this was all just a game to him. Fine, he said, straightening his tie. Let's move on, but I hope you're ready, Mr. Reed, because the truth has a funny way of slipping out. Marcus didn't say anything. He just held Holloway's gaze. Deep down, Holloway thought he was winning. But that was about to change. Just as Holloway prepared to continue his attack, the prosecution attorney stood up. Their voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor, the defense has spent a great deal of time questioning this witness's credibility," they said. "But we have new evidence that will clear up any doubt." Holloway raised an eyebrow. "New evidence?" he repeated, trying to sound unimpressed. The judge glanced at the prosecution. "Explain." The attorney held up a small USB drive. "We have security footage from a nearby store. It captured the night of the incident clearly. We request permission to present it to the court." A murmur ran through the courtroom. People shifted in their seats. Even some of the jury members leaned forward, suddenly more interested. Holloway forced a chuckle. "Your Honor, this is highly unusual," he said. "The prosecution is just trying to create drama." The judge didn't look convinced. "Mr. Holloway, if this footage is relevant, the jury has the right to see it." Objection overruled. She turned to the bailiff. "Play the footage." Marcus felt his heart race. He hadn't known there was a recording. He had spent the entire testimony defending himself against doubt. Now, the truth would finally speak for itself. Holloway shifted slightly, but his smirk remained. He folded his arms, pretending not to care. The courtroom screen lit up. The video began playing. At first, the image was blurry, the camera angle slightly tilted. But then, the scene became clear. A man, dressed exactly as Marcus had described, stood near the alleyway. His face was unmistakable. The defendant, Mr. Lancaster, was right there at the crime scene. Gasps filled the courtroom. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Marcus stared at the screen. He had known the truth, but seeing it confirmed like this was still overwhelming. Holloway's smirk faded for the first time. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. The prosecution attorney turned toward the jury. "As you can see, the witness was telling the truth all along." Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The evidence was right there. And suddenly, the entire courtroom felt different. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the hum of the video playing on the screen. All eyes were locked on the footage. The security camera had captured everything. The streetlights cast a clear glow over the scene. The defendant, Mr. Lancaster, stood exactly where Marcus had said he was. His face was unmistakable. His movements matched Marcus's testimony perfectly. Then, the most damning part played. The footage showed Lancaster pulling something from his pocket, something small but important. A few moments later, he disappeared down the alley. Seconds later, a commotion followed, just like Marcus had described. A murmur spread through the courtroom. A few jury members exchanged looks. They had just spent the last hour listening to Holloway attack Marcus's memory, his credibility, even his character. But now, the truth was playing in front of them in crystal-clear video. Holloway shifted in his seat. He looked stiff now, his usual smug confidence nowhere to be seen. The prosecution attorney let the video finish, then turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this footage confirms every detail of Mr. Reed's testimony. He wasn't mistaken, he wasn't confused, he saw exactly what happened." Marcus sat still, his hands gripping the sides of the witness stand. After everything Holloway had thrown at him, every insult, every attempt to humiliate him, his truth had been proven. The judge turned to Holloway. "Would the defense like to respond?" Holloway hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at his client, who looked just as stunned as he was. Finally, he forced a chuckle. "Well, Your Honor," he said, but his voice wasn't as smooth this time. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Someone in the audience scoffed. A few heads shook. They all knew exactly what had happened. Marcus didn't need to say anything. He had defended himself enough. The footage had done the rest. The judge adjusted her glasses. "I suggest you choose your next words carefully, Mr. Holloway," she said. For the first time that day, the lawyer had nothing to say. Holloway shifted uncomfortably, his usual arrogance gone. He looked at the jury, then at the judge, as if searching for a way out. But there was none. The evidence was undeniable. The prosecution attorney crossed their arms. "Mr. Holloway, you spent this entire trial trying to discredit an innocent witness. Do you have anything to say now that the truth is in front of us?" Holloway cleared his throat. "Well," he began, forcing a weak smile, "it seems there may have been some errors in judgment." "Errors in judgment?" The attorney raised an eyebrow. You tried to paint Mr. Reed as unreliable. You implied he was dishonest. You questioned his character. They gestured toward the screen. And now this footage proves he was telling the truth the entire time. The jury members didn't look at Holloway the same way anymore. The trust he had tried to build was gone. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Mr. Holloway, I suggest you reconsider your approach for the remainder of this trial. Her voice was firm. Your tactics today have been concerning, to say the least. Marcus sat quietly, watching it all unfold. He had endured the lawyer's attacks, the disrespect, the humiliation, but in the end the truth had won. Holloway took a slow breath and turned to his client, Mr. Lancaster. The businessman looked pale, his hands gripping the table tightly. He knew this was bad. The prosecution attorney glanced at Marcus and gave him a slight nod. It was a silent acknowledgement. He had stood his ground, and justice was catching up. Holloway sighed, rubbing his forehead. His reputation had taken a serious hit. He had walked into this trial thinking he could manipulate the jury, twist words, and break a witness. Instead, he had humiliated himself. He straightened his tie, trying to regain control. Well, Your Honor, I suppose we'll have to reevaluate our approach moving forward. The judge nodded. That would be wise. The courtroom was still tense, but now the energy had shifted. The power Holloway once had was gone, and Marcus? He had nothing more to prove.